Good morning, everyone. Happy Saturday. I'm really excited to have all of you here today. I see we have about 84 in Google Meet, and then I'm sure we have many more on YouTube. So thank you for taking the time to attend today's presentation. So today's presentation is translanguaging in Taiwan's bilingual education. And I find this topic to be very interesting because translanguaging is actually a rather complicated term. The reason it's complicated is somewhat historical. When the term was first coined, it was first used in Wales in the late 1980s, early 1990s, and it appeared in a dissertation in early 1990, I think around 1991. What it meant in that context is very different than how people use the word today, because the word has kind of taken a split depending on what people's goals are, and it can mean different things. So I want to start today's presentation by asking all of you, how much do you know about this word translanguaging? So on your Pear Deck now, you can select your response. Okay, so we can see from today's group, the majority of you have heard of it. You've heard of this term, which is good. That's a really good starting point. Some of you know quite a bit about it, and some of you can even explain it. So that's good too. Hopefully, no matter where you are today, whether you know very little to nothing, all the way up to you can explain it to a friend. I hope today gives you some things to think about. Now, as I was saying, translanguaging can be kind of complicated because it means a lot of different things. It has taken on many different meanings. And so today I hope to sort of demystify that. Those of you that know it, maybe you know one meaning, but maybe you haven't heard of some of the others. And those of you that haven't heard of it at all, hopefully today's conversation will help you understand it better. So my goals for this hour and a half. First, by the end of today, I hope that you can describe 3 functions of pedagogical translanguaging. As I said, translanguaging can mean different things. And when we talk specifically about pedagogical translanguaging, the translanguaging of the classroom, we can actually divide that even further into 3 different types. And I believe all 3 types have a role in bilingual education. So we'll talk about those 3 functions, and I hope that you can go back to your schools and describe those 3 functions to your colleagues in your school. Second, I do want to hopefully make this a little bit practical. It's going to be a bit on the theoretical side, but I don't think there's, from my perspective, there's nothing more practical than a good theory. So I'm hoping that by understanding and being able to describe the 3 functions of pedagogical translanguaging, you'll also be able to explain to your colleagues in your school how these 3 functions can be incorporated into different lessons, the creation of materials. And although we won't talk necessarily so much about assessment today, hopefully by understanding the 3 functions of pedagogical translanguaging, you can also build this into your assessment as well. I'd like to ask you another question. This is just an agree or disagree, and I'd like you to answer this on Pear Deck. So I want you to imagine a scenario. Your principal says to you, a bilingual teacher in Taiwan should try to use as much English as possible, only using Mandarin when students need the support. 100% English is the ultimate goal if possible. If your principal said this to you, would you agree with the principal or would you have a problem with it? Please put agree or disagree in your Pear Deck now. Okay. So this is rather interesting. The majority of the group tends to disagree. We have uh, the vast majority. We have 44 with disagree and 8 with agree. So I'm going to go ahead and lock this right now. I'm going to go ahead and lock the screens. So you cannot submit any longer. I would like to hear from both sides. If anybody is willing, if you're in the Google Meet, I'd like to hear someone from the agree side. Could you turn on your microphone and share why you agree? And if you'd like to, 如果你要用中文回答，你也可以，因为今天是 translanguaging，所以两个语言都可以利用，所以不要怕，就打开 microphone 跟我说。Anyone from the agree? Okay, cool. How about from the disagree? Would someone from the disagree like to tell me why you disagree with the principle? Joy Chen.
I would like to share my opinion. I used to in the agree team, agree group, because I think if the teacher can use the 100% English in the classroom, the student will learn. And also, if the teacher can speak English, the English all the time in English, the student will try their best to speak in English too. But some results I found out it's not like this, because for the low achievement students, when you are speaking English with all English in the classroom, some of them they might not get them, and then us alone, like the when it's like after some periods, they will automatic shut their ears. They won't listen because they even they have questions, they are too shy to ask. So days by days, they will become late behind. So I think sometimes you need to make sure that if you want to use 100% English in class, it really depends on the ability of your student. If you find out your student the ability is not so good, maybe you should use the translanguage instead. Yeah, that's my opinion.
All right, thank you, Joy, for sharing. And yeah, I think this is the concern of a lot of teachers, that 100% English is not possible. And you can see, people in the chat are also talking about things related to stressful situations, and the inability for communication, and of course content is the most important. So I want to unpack this a little bit, because the way I worded this was very specific in terms of what Joy said, and in terms of what some of you had said about concerns about students. The principal is giving the green light, saying, okay, you can use Mandarin when the students need the support. So the principal isn't saying you have to use 100% English, but we should try to go for that. So in many ways, this kind of can support what Joy was saying. If our students are struggling, the principal says it's okay to use Mandarin for support. This is a common thought right now with bilingual education. But as we continue today's conversation about translanguaging, what I want you to know is that translanguaging is compatible with this statement, but not all functions of translanguaging are compatible, as we will talk about later. Let me quickly see some of these other comments. Someone says, it says bilingual, so I assume that 2 languages are involved. But that still, I think, works with this. The principle is saying that Mandarin can be used for support, so 2 languages are involved. Okay, and then, one other comment is about, converting between these languages and use it freely. That's an interesting comment, and one that I'd like to unpack a little bit later. But let's go on to one more scenario before we get into the actual what is translanguaging and these different functions. So your principal comes to you. Let's say it's a different principal, different year, new principal. And they say, I think our teachers should use classroom English. Things like, good morning, class. How are you? Open your book to page 5. Please line up. Those types of things. I think our teachers should use classroom English with the students. But I think there is no need to incorporate English into the content instruction. So things about actually teaching the content. Do you agree or disagree? I feel like the people in this room don't like their principal very much because all we do is disagree with the principal. This hypothetical principle. So we have a lot of disagrees, but we do have some agrees. It seems like some people also agree in the chat. One person wrote, classroom English is a start for bilingual class. And as you said, maybe depending on your school, this is a good place to start because many students come into bilingual education, particularly right now. This is the first time. And so, we can, slowly get our students comfortable with English and also, not affect content learning. Because I know earlier with our last question, some comments were concerned about, well, what is the effect of, content learning? Because content should be the goal. This is also a function of translanguaging. Translanguaging can be used in this way. But as there's in the comments we can see people said they still need instruction and it should not be the limit. In some classes, we may want to go beyond this, and translanguaging can help us do that too. So let's talk about what is this word translanguaging. Okay, so if I, on a very simple level, we can say the definition of translanguaging is when 2 or more languages are used in communication. Okay. Now, this definition is not necessarily strictly about the classroom. It can be also talking about in the real world. So for example, my beautiful wife is Taiwanese, and hopefully she's listening because I use that adjective beautiful. That'll get me points for the day. If you were to come into our house and kind of like spy on us and see like, oh, how do they interact? You would notice that throughout the day, my interaction with my wife uses both languages. And what you would also notice is that there isn't really any pattern. There really isn't any logic to when one language appears and another language appears. You would notice that it just kind of happens naturally. That we flow between the languages, kind of without thought. And that is one of the characteristics of translanguaging. If we look at letter A on characteristics, translanguaging is a natural occurrence in bilingual communication. So when two bilinguals are talking to each other and, there aren't any like, you know, specific rules for that setting, like in my home, there are no linguistic rules for that setting, well, then naturally both languages are going to be used. And it's often spontaneous. My wife and I, we don't really think about which language we're using with each other at any given time. It just, whatever happens, happens. But this is where we start to see different types of translanguaging. Because so far I've talked about my home life with my wife. However, my choices with my son are a little bit different. I am very specific about the languages that I use with my son and try to be very specific about the language sees me using with other people. And in many ways, my interactions with my son are much more like the education type of translanguaging, where things can be very planned. We plan based on what are our ultimate goals. Whereas in real life, kind of like with my wife, it's more spontaneous. Now, particularly in education, point C, each language has a role in the communication process. In natural settings, we use both languages as the means of communication. But in the classroom, when things are much more planned, we often assign roles to languages in those communication settings. And in both of our examples here, this first one, bilingual teachers in Taiwan should use as much English as possible with Mandarin used as support. You can kind of see that these two languages, English and Mandarin, have been assigned roles. English is the main instructional language, and Mandarin has been assigned a role of support. Whereas in this setting, where the principal says only use classroom English, no need to incorporate English into content instruction, English has been assigned a role of just for classroom management purposes. And Mandarin has been assigned a role as a main instructional language. So one of the key things about when we talk about translanguaging in education and for you as teachers is you have to, when you're implementing translanguaging, you have to be very conscious of what is the role of the languages. We'll talk more about that when we talk about the different functions. Finally, translanguaging is not translation. I want to be very clear about this. If you go into your classroom and you say one thing in English, and then your next sentence is the exact same thing in Mandarin, or vice versa, you say something in Mandarin, and then you say the exact same sentence in English, that is not translanguaging. That is translation. The two are very different. And sometimes they're often thought of as very similar. But in terms of what I'm promoting today, in terms of a very strategic pedagogical translanguaging in bilingual education, translation is not necessarily considered part of that. So a teacher that translates one sentence back and forth, I would not consider as implementing translanguaging in the classroom. So that brings us to our examples. One example of translanguaging, a teacher explains the first part of a concept in English. For example, let's say there's the water cycle, and the water cycle has multiple parts. Maybe they explain the first part of the cycle in English, but the second part of this cycle in Mandarin. Essentially, it's the same communicative goal. I want my students to understand the water cycle, but different parts of the water cycle are taught using different languages. In this scenario, both languages have a role of instruction, but different parts of the communicative process. This is a type of translanguaging. We'll talk about what exactly that type is in a moment. But again, our non-example, a teacher says an English definition and then translates it directly into Mandarin. That is not translanguaging, that is translation. Okay? I will make sure at the end of today to leave enough time for questions, because I know some of you may be a little confused right now. This will make a lot more sense when we talk about the different functions. Okay, so if you are a little confused right now, embrace that confusion. Take hold of it. It will make more sense. And when you go back at the end of today's presentation and look at this slide, I think things will make a lot more sense when we talk about more details. Okay. But since that was a lot of talking, let's take a break for a second. And I'm very curious. I talked about the interactions of me and my wife, how we use English and Mandarin kind of fluidly without any thought. I'm curious, in your family, do you translanguage? Do you ever do translanguaging with people in your family or translanguage with other bilingual friends? So I'll show you the poll. Most people are saying yes, they do this. A few people are saying no. There was a not sure, but they ran away. So not sure is gone now. I see translanguaging in Taiwan every day. Every day. Now I live in Geelong. I don't live in Taipei. But in Geelong, as I'm walking, as I go to different places like the breakfast shop in the morning, I hear translanguaging all the time. Not Mandarin and English translanguaging, usually, Mandarin and Taiwanese. I hear that all the time. And in my household, I hear it a lot too. When, you know, when Nai Nai is at our house, my mother-in-law will be talking to her, mostly in Taiwanese, but sometimes in Mandarin. My wife also will mix um, when she's talking to her grandmother. In fact, translanguaging is something that occurs throughout Taiwan. But I do want to make a point. That type of translanguaging, the type that happens every day all around us in many of your households, that's what we call spontaneous translanguaging. It's the translanguaging that's used in natural conversation. And the key thing about spontaneous translanguaging is that it's not planned. It's something that just happens naturally. Now, more often than not, when people talk about translanguaging, I often hear them talking about spontaneous translanguaging, even in the classroom. This idea that, oh, if you see students are confused when you say something in English, oh, well, just switch over to Mandarin, translanguage. Spontaneous translanguaging is something that happens all the time. But that is not the type of translanguaging that we are going to be talking about today. Today, we're going to be talking about pedagogical or fixed translanguaging. It's what I think can often be used in bilingual education. And very specifically, it's planned. It's not like spontaneous translanguaging. Pedagogical translanguaging is planned. It's very strategic. And it serves different goals. Now, one thing I had seen in the comments earlier, Shohoi Liu at 10:51 a.m. said if you want to immerse students in an English environment, you need to use English as much as possible. One question that we have to ask is bilingual education, are our bilingual classes supposed to be immersion in English? Is really our goal to immerse the students in as much English as possible? Or are we supposed to be creating a bilingual environment? If it's about immersing, because there isn't a right answer to this, I do want to clarify that, there are legitimate reasons why you might want to incorporate immersion in your school. And there are legitimate reasons why you might not. That's kind of outside of the scope of today's conversation. But whatever choice you make, immersion in one language or, a more bilingual environment, whatever choice you decide as a teacher and a school changes the way that you're going to use translanguaging. Because in this immersion setting, spontaneous translanguaging is probably appropriate. But if you're trying to actually create a very strategic bilingual environment within your classroom, then I believe pedagogical translanguaging, the very planned use of languages, is necessary. So, if we choose to do pedagogical translanguaging, well, how do we do that? How is that possible? Well, you actually have three choices. There are three types of three functions of pedagogical translanguaging. The first one is symbolic. The second one is supportive. And the third one is instructional. So three different ways that we can practice pedagogical translanguaging. That is, three ways that we can plan how we use languages, multiple languages, in the classroom. I'll talk about each one of these now and give you some time to think about how these can be used in your classrooms and your schools. So let's talk about the symbolic function first. As I had mentioned, one of the characteristics of translanguaging, particularly pedagogical translanguaging, is that each language has a role in the communicative process. So if we are going to practice pedagogical translanguaging in the classroom, we have to be clear on what roles we want different languages to take at different parts of our lesson or in our class as a whole. So the first function, the symbolic function, has two languages. Language A, which I will not define as any language at this point. We'll just leave it as a ambiguous language A. Language A is the main language of learning. So if you are using the symbolic function in your classroom, there is a core language that you are going to use for all instructional and learning purposes. Now, in many cases, language A has been Mandarin in Taiwan because Mandarin is the language of instruction in most classes in Taiwan. But now that we've added bilingual education, the main language may change to something else, particularly if you're doing immersion. So language A is the main language. So what about language B? What purpose does that serve? Well, language B is a language that students know, but it's seen as a bonus language in the classroom. In other words, we don't use it for instruction. It's something that just happens in the class. Or, sometimes we ask students to present that language, but it doesn't really serve any, what I will call, instructional utility. It's more about celebrating bilingualism. So I'm going to give you an example. I, many, many years ago, I had gone to a high school to watch an English class. This was during my um, eh, way before I came to Shida. And I went to go sit in this language class to kind of see what local English classes were like. And I remember that when I watched this high school English class, I would say 90 to 95% of the course was taught in Mandarin. So in this case, language A was clearly Mandarin in that classroom. And I would say maybe 2 or 3% was English, because obviously that was the content. That was the content of the course. It was an English course. So what about the remaining percentage? It was Taiwanese. And if I were to define kind of how translanguaging was happening in this classroom, I would say that language A was Mandarin, but language B was Taiwanese. It was clearly being used in that classroom um, as kind of a bonus language, as a way to connect with students, as a way to, maybe do some classroom management things, or just as, just as a way to show that, yes, the students here are multilingual, Mandarin, Taiwanese, and because they were in an English class, of course, they had a certain degree of English. But Taiwanese was not serving any instructional utility. It was not the main language of learning. Mandarin was serving the purpose for students to learn about the English language. So the symbolic function is very much about students showing their bilingualism and celebrating it. So let me give you an example. I will let you read this because I don't think you came here today to test my Mandarin reading abilities. So I'll give you a moment to read this. Okay. So uh, this is obviously a PE class. And you can see that in this scenario, the PE class is a Mandarin-based PE class. The teacher is clearly using Mandarin um, as the main language of instruction. Although in this scenario, it's kind of more, logistics at this point. Talking about who did what in the race. But the teacher does something very interesting here. The teacher specifically asks students, "Oh, I think in English class, you learned how to say this. Can anybody tell me what it is?" And the student responds, "I know, when there is a will, there is a way." What's interesting about this is that, obviously English is not the main language of instruction. And in fact, English is not serving any purpose for the instruction of PE. But what the teacher has done is has given the students an opportunity to show their bilingualism, to show and recognize that, yes, I know that you are learning English. I know that you can use English. So show me that you can use English. Let me celebrate that in this short scenario. This is a clear example of the symbolic function. When the teacher gives the students the opportunity to showcase that they are bilingual. It does not serve, again, an instructional purpose. It's more about celebrating and acknowledging the languages of the students. So I want to share with you my thoughts on the symbolic function, because I think it's a function that is being underutilized right now in Taiwan, but I think it's a very important one that we need to really consider. So my first point, the symbolic function, it can be used in every single classroom in a bilingual school. It is not exclusive to bilingual classes. So if your school has committed to being a so-called bilingual school, obviously some classes have been assigned as bilingual classes where there's an expectation that a good amount of English is being used in some form. Whereas the rest of the classes are business as usual in Mandarin, presumably. If we really truly want bilingual schools, not just individual bilingual classes, one thing that I think we can do is we can encourage all teachers to try to incorporate the symbolic function. Something as simple as, does anyone know how to say that in English? And then continuing on with your Mandarin instruction. In this sense, translanguaging can be used to really create an entire bilingual environment, showing students that in every subject, their bilingualism is celebrated, their bilingualism can be used, not just in isolated classes in the school. And to be honest, teachers don't necessarily have to know whether the student, uh, you know, said it correctly or not. Because oftentimes the symbolic function in places like the United States, it's often used by teachers who don't speak the language of the students. So for example, they may present a concept and ask a Vietnamese student, how might you say that in your language? And then ask a Spanish speaking student, what about in Spanish? The symbolic function is to show that, your bilingualism is celebrated and the languages you know can be used everywhere, even if the teacher doesn't know it. So I think the symbolic function serves a very specific purpose within an entire system. And I think every teacher, regardless of their English proficiency, can utilize it. And that kind of leads to my second point, is that it's a great way to acknowledge bilingualism across the curriculum, not just in certain subjects. Now, finally, as many of you know, there are two policies right now that regarding language in education. There is the bilingual 2030 policy, which is what we're mostly talking about, I think, in these workshops. But then there is also the local language policy that is trying to promote more local language use. And that current policy implements local language classes, maybe like 2 periods a week, where you would learn, where students would take a class in Hakka or Taiwanese. I've always been somewhat critical that those two policies have been separated. And the reason I'm critical of that is that I believe that the local languages can be brought into every classroom too, perhaps through the symbolic function of translanguaging. Maybe we ask our teachers, hey, do some classroom language in the local language of this school, whether that is Hakka, Taiwanese, or some other language. Keep Mandarin as the main instructional language, but incorporate the local languages in, for example, classroom language. Going back to our scenario from before, this one, I think our teachers should use classroom English with the students, but don't incorporate it into content instruction. This is another example of the symbolic function, but a greater use than before. Because English, or you can replace classroom English with classroom Taiwanese or classroom Hakka. That language that's being used for classroom language, we would call that symbolic because it's not serving the instructional role. So even though today we're mainly talking about Mandarin and English in the classroom, I do want to encourage you to think about, consider whether the symbolic function, whether language A and language B, particularly language B, could also be a local language. Maybe in some classes, language A remains Mandarin, but language B sometimes is English, sometimes is a local language. Because I think it's very important to promote, if we're going to be a bilingual or multilingual school, I, I firmly believe that it cannot just happen in isolated classrooms. It has to be throughout the curriculum. So that is the symbolic function. I want to give you 1 minute to reflect on this. Okay, so if you are in the Pear Deck, you can type in your answers directly here. I'm curious, do you think you could use the symbolic function in your classroom? Simple yes or no. And if so, how might you do that in your specific subject? You're also welcome to use the Google Meet chat, as some of you have, if you're more comfortable with that. I'll give you a minute to respond. 英文、中文都可以. That was a symbolic use of Mandarin. So I see several people have written about, greeting students in perhaps language B. I think that's a really great way to use it as well. When students come in, we greet them using language B and then transition to language A. So um, I think that's a really good use as well, and a really good example of the symbolic function. One other thing, as I close this part and go to the next, we often talk about bilingual education in terms of our Taiwanese students, our local students. But as a foreigner, I'm quite sensitive to this. That in many cases, your classrooms um, have some multicultural students. Sometimes Vietnamese, Indonesian students, where one parent is from a different country. We can also encourage those students, if you have them in your classroom, to share their languages as well. So, if you know that one student maybe speaks Vietnamese with their mother or father, even though that you don't speak Vietnamese, you can encourage the symbolic function there too. So, keep in mind that this isn't exclusive to Mandarin, English, or a Taiwanese local language. We can also think about the other languages that our students might speak at home as well, and celebrate those. Because traditionally, those languages have not had a role in our schools. And I think translanguaging gives us the um, option to incorporate those more. Okay. So I'd like to move on. Thank you for your responses. I'd like to, for the sake of time, I'd like to move on to the next function. This is called the supportive function. Sometimes it's also called the scaffolding function. But for today's purposes, I will use the supportive function. So going back to language roles, if you recall, there was one main language when we were talking about the symbolic function. In the supportive function, it's the same thing. There is one main language. Language A is the main language of learning. However, language B takes a bit of a different role. than it did in the symbolic function. Where in the symbolic function, language B was kind of just a bonus. It was just kind of a way to let students show their bilingualism, let them, to celebrate it. Language B serves a different purpose for the supportive function. The idea of language B is used to support or scaffold learning in language A. However, it's without any expectation that language B takes a main role for language learning in the future. The purpose of this is to facilitate learning in language A. So if you recall, if we go back to the principal examples from earlier, the principle here is promoting the supportive function of translanguaging. The principle is essentially saying, I want you to try to use English as much as possible. In other words, English should be the main language of learning, the main language of instruction. But acknowledging that that may be difficult for students, that they are not in a position to use English 100%, Mandarin can be used to support learning through English. But the principle is essentially saying that 100% English is the ultimate goal. In other words, there is not necessarily a goal for Mandarin to serve an instructional purpose in this classroom. Mandarin should be for a supportive purpose only. And this is very much the supportive function of translanguaging. And in many ways, I think this is in many ways, I think this is often how translanguaging is talked about, particularly in contexts where immersion is the goal. Because when I talk to teachers, they often say things like, oh, Taiwanese students can't necessarily do an all-English class. We have to use Mandarin. They won't learn if we only use English, or it's too stressful, or, a variety of reasons. But usually my follow-up question when I'm talking to teachers, I ask them, I want you to imagine a time 20 years later, and in your classroom, you have a group of students, a group of elite students that could use either language, that teaching through either language would be effective because they've been in bilingual education for a long time, for example. Would you still use Mandarin in your class if you had a group of elite students where language was not a problem? And many of them will answer, no, then I guess I'll just use English. And that tells me that their use of Mandarin is the supportive function. There's nothing wrong with that. This is a legitimate use of translanguaging. But we need to make sure that we separate this type of function, the supportive function, from other types of functions, and acknowledge that we are putting Mandarin in a supportive function. When we talk about the last function, that will make more sense of why that's important. But I want to go to an example. So what might the supportive function look like in a bilingual classroom? Well, here's an example. The teacher says, does anyone still remember the meaning of traveling in basketball games? Student raises their hand and says, 旅行. Okay, so I want to stop there for a second because we already sort of see a supportive function here. The teacher asks in English and then a student answers in Mandarin, presumably because they couldn't in English. And you'll see the teacher responds, well, nice try. They acknowledge that response. So at this point in the conversation, the teacher has made the decision that when I ask a question in English, I will allow my students to answer in Mandarin to support their learning in English. It's a conscious choice because the teacher could have consciously chosen to say, well, how do you say that in English? Like, can you say it in English? But they didn't. They accepted it because they view Mandarin in that supportive role of learning in English. Now we continue. Well, nice try. But traveling in basketball games is not 旅行。但是如果你在篮球比赛带着球走，会乘坐圆球走步。I tried my best. Thanks. I probably should have practiced that before today, but whatever. I survived. That is called traveling. Do we have any other questions? If not, let the games begin. So this is a key, again, the teacher makes a key choice here. I'm going to define this in Mandarin. I'm going to say that in a basketball game, holding the ball and walking is called traveling. Why did the teacher do this? Is this because Mandarin is a main instructional language? I don't think so. The teacher made the choice to explain it in Mandarin to, again, support the learning in English. In fact, them saying this is not playing a role in having them be able to use Mandarin in the PE class. It's playing a role of helping them understand English PE learning. Now, I will be honest with you. The distinction and being able to separate this from, a supportive function and a learning function sometimes is a little bit difficult to do. I struggle with it myself. But I do think it's important, at least conceptually, that as teachers, we understand that these can be separated. And so my interpretation of this, without talking to this teacher, is that this is used for a supportive function, but English remains the main instructional language. Okay. So I'd like to give you my thoughts on the supportive function. I think it can be a very important function in the bilingual classroom. Why? Because it's a very effective strategy for bridging learning between languages. If you look at this picture on the slide, we can use L1 academic oral language down here to support L2 academic oral language learning here. We can use L1 everyday language, following this blue arrow, to support L2 academic written language, or this green arrow, L1 everyday oral language, to support L2 oral language. All of these things can connect, bridging, but that's all it's simply doing, is bridging. It isn't necessarily, even though this picture has arrows going both ways, the supportive function usually only goes one way. Language B supporting the learning in language A. Now, despite that, I think supportive function has a very important role in bilingual education, and it's one that I believe all bilingual teachers should utilize. We need to keep in mind that the supportive role is not going to support the development of academic literacies in both languages. It's only going to support the development of academic literacies in one language, language A. Now, that's a lot of academic jargon, and you're probably like, that's too much for a Saturday morning. Your coffee's not strong enough for that. So let me share a quick story. It will make sense from this quick story. I attended a talk on EMI about 2 weeks ago here at NTNU. And it was my good friend, Dr. Zhang from NTU, who gave the talk. And after her talk, a professor from National Taipei Hospital University, I think that's the name, raised his hand. And he shared a story. He said, in our medical school, we teach medicine through English. All the textbooks are in English. Maybe the teacher, might use some Mandarin, but the main instructional language of medicine is English. And it's been that way since I got my medical degree in the early 1990s, the professor said. So EMI is not really a new thing. In 1990, he received his medical education in English as well. And as you would expect, his English in terms of talking about medicine is very strong. But he shared a story. He said he went to China to, give a talk or attend something at another medical school. And he explained in China, they do all medical education in Chinese. And he said, I had trouble understanding what they were saying. A Taiwanese professor of medicine went to China and had trouble communicating about medicine because he did not know the Chinese terms for medicine and his Chinese counterparts did not know the English because they learned medicine in Chinese and he learned medicine in Taiwan through English. I share this story because you cannot assume just because your student is Taiwanese and uses Mandarin at home, you cannot assume that they will be able to use Mandarin in your subject if that subject is taught mostly through English. And that professor is a key example of this. Of course, his Mandarin is great. He is a native speaker of Mandarin. He is a Taiwanese professor. But his education in medicine was all in English, and he does not have the linguistic resources. He does not have the terms to talk about medicine through Mandarin. If you choose the supportive function, and the supportive function is the only thing used in bilingual education in your subject throughout a child's schooling, similar things are likely to happen. Students might only be able to speak about, for example, PE in English and struggle to speak about it in Mandarin or music or biology. And I think, some people think, when I've given these talks before that, I'm, exaggerating and like, oh, that's not possible. Our students speak Mandarin. But that example of that professor, I think proved my point that it's already happened in this country far before we had a bilingual policy. So while I believe the supportive function can be an effective strategy, I don't think it is the only strategy that should be used in our bilingual education. For the sake of time, I'm going to skip this question, but I do want you to think about, could you use the supportive function in your classroom? And if so, how? I apologize that I can't give you more time to reflect on this, but I will go on for the sake of time. So this brings us to our final function, the instructional function. Now, if you truly want a bilingual class, not an immersion class, because that's a different thing. And as I said earlier, there is a place for immersion education. That can be part of a larger system if your school chooses. But if you want a truly bilingual class that avoids producing students that can only talk about their subject in one language and not both, then I think you have to implement the instructional function of translanguaging. So in the instructional function, language A and language B are both main languages of learning. Both are used for learning, but they may not be used at the same time, or they might, as we will talk about. There's two different ways to do this. And the idea is the purpose to facilitate learning in both languages. So going back to that story, if the instructional function was used in medical school in Taiwan, then those doctors that graduated with medical degrees would be able to go to China and talk about medicine through Mandarin, while also being able to go, for example, to the United States and speak about medicine in English. There are two methods of doing this. These are strict separation and concurrent. And I'll give you examples of both. So let's look at our first example. For the sake of time, I'm going to read the English, but I will let you read the Chinese. Everybody, 6 people in a row and line up behind the starting line. Make sure you have enough space to do the running drills. After hearing the whistle, the person who stands in front will start to do the movement. All right, the first one is jogging. Beep, go, go, go. So that's activity 1. Now the PE teacher is going to do activity 2. I'll give you a moment to read the Chinese. So let me explain the teacher's strategy here. The teacher is, and I see Professor Chen is making faces. I hope this isn't a bad PE example. I'm doing my best, but so forgive this if this is not necessarily like the most authentic thing for PE. But the idea of this teacher was that I'm going to have my students do different drills, exercise drills in my PE class. Some of those drills, I will do the explaining and instruction in English, while other drills, I will do them in Mandarin. I am strictly separating the languages, but I'm taking my entire lesson plan and cutting the learning into different pieces and making sure that my students are getting learning and instructional opportunities in both languages throughout my lesson. So you will notice that both languages are important for instruction, but their importance happens at different times in the lesson. This is what we would call strict separation. And going back to really quickly to this. When I gave this example, a teacher explains the first part of a concept, and I use the example of the water cycle in English, and then the second part of the cycle in Mandarin. This is an example of the instructional function of translanguaging, where a teacher, and specifically the strict separation of instructional function. They take the whole concept, they cut it into pieces, and then they assign an instructional language to each piece with the goal that students experience learning in both languages. Now, as I said, that's only one type of the instructional function, strict separation. There's also another function called the concurrent. Now, I'll give you some scenarios where the concurrent can be used. So for example, let's say that your instructional goal is students will read a text on Mozart, for example. We'll go to music for a second. So I'm going to give them a short text on Mozart. And then I want them to be able to summarize that text in a short form, telling me about Mozart's life. So if we're doing the concurrent form where both languages are occurring at the same time, that text will be in language B, but the summary, they will write it in language A. So for example, maybe I'm going to have them write a summary in English. We'll make language A English, but the text I give them is in Mandarin. So Mandarin becomes language B. Read in Mandarin, write a summary in English. Now, this kind of scenario is very practical for Taiwanese education because a lot of bilingual teachers will say, how do I do bilingual education? My textbook is in Mandarin. Well, you can do the concurrent instructional function using your Mandarin textbook, but then asking students to do something in English after reading the text. You have been set up to do this type of translanguaging in your classrooms. Now, it doesn't necessarily have to be write a summary. You could have them read the text in Mandarin and then ask students a question in English. I used to have my students make a student quiz. So you can have them do something. You're all teachers. You have creative ways to do these things. But the purpose is language A and language B are used concurrently, one assigned to one type of language skill and the other. We can also do this with questioning. So if we look at number 2, the teacher asks a question in language A and requests students to answer in language B. Now that's a key word there, requests. So when we saw the supportive function, the teacher just allowed another language because that's what the student produced. But maybe the teacher, if they're using the instructional function, let me go back to that example. Does anyone still remember the meaning of traveling in basketball games? Tell me in Mandarin. Now the teacher has made a specific choice. I want you to answer this question in Mandarin. Now, maybe they ask this question in, English. Sorry, in Chinese. 大家记得圆球走步是什么？用英文给我回答. I don't know if that was very good Chinese. Sorry. But I think you get the idea. The teacher specifically says, I want you to use this language, which is different than the language I'm asking the question in. So that can also be a version of concurrent instructional function. One last example. I need to hurry up so that there's enough time for questions. Students state their opinion in language A. I think this, but then explain why in language B. 我觉得是这样，因为 blah, 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 blah. Okay? But it can flip. Maybe they state their opinion in Mandarin and explain why in English. Language A and language B should never be the same. When you're using concurrent, for example, you should never always ask the question in Mandarin and always ask them to answer in English. It should always flip throughout. For the instructional function to work, they get experience doing all of these things in all of the languages. And that's my important note here. Language A and B should alternate roles throughout the curriculum. So if you have a text in Mandarin one day, maybe you have a text in English another day. And the idea, again, is for learning to happen in both languages. So what are my thoughts on the instructional function? First, I want to acknowledge to do the instructional function in a bilingual class is very, very difficult. I do not want to, sit here and pretend like it's an easy thing. Why is it difficult? Because you have to make so many choices as a teacher in ways that you do not have to do in any other type of teaching. You have to be very strategic about how am I going to use language at every moment of my class. So the instructional function requires a lot more planning and thought. So I want to acknowledge that because teachers are busy. You have a lot to do. You have a lot to handle. The instructional function is very difficult to do in practice. However, if your class is only offered in one setting where you are the only biology class, using the instructional function of translanguaging, I think, is the only way to develop bilingualism in that subject. Of course, if your school has a biology class in English for some periods and a biology class in Mandarin for some periods, and they're separate, well, then you can still develop bilingualism across the system, not necessarily in the classroom. But most public schools are not set up to do that. That only really happens in private schools, to my knowledge. So this is the only way to develop true bilingualism. But I also have to, to make sure I don't get deported by the Taiwanese government, the instructional function is not aligned with the current policy. The current policy on bilingual education, in my reading of it, it promotes the supportive function of translanguaging, not necessarily the instructional function of translanguaging. So please be aware of that. That, while I believe instructional function is the way forward for Taiwanese bilingual education, the way the policy is worded at this point does not support that. The policy for the high schools specifically says English is the main language, Mandarin is the supportive language. And I believe I showed that in my presentation a month or so ago when we started this program. So if you have those slides, you can go back to that wording if you are unsure. So those are the three functions. We talked about three functions today. Let me go to that slide really quickly. We talked about the symbolic function, where one language is a main language, the other language is kind of a bonus to support and celebrate bilingualism. We talked about supportive, where one language is a main language and one language is there to support learning in that language. And we talked about the instructional function, where two languages serve as main languages of instruction. I want to reemphasize, I believe all these types of translanguaging serve purposes in a bilingual education school. I believe all of these can be used throughout a bilingual school. But in certain classes, I do think it is important that certain functions are there and maybe other functions are not. And hopefully today's talk gave you an idea of what type of classes these functions are suited for. So with that in mind, we have 10 minutes left. And while I wanted to give you some time to think about how you could use the instructional function in your class, I think it's important that we do some questions. So before we do questions, I want to allow you some reflection time. At the beginning of today, I asked you, how much do you know about translanguaging? I'd like you to answer that question one more time. And hopefully everybody has heard of it at least. Okay, and it's okay if you only know very little about it. I do want to emphasize translanguaging is very complex. And if nothing else, I think today's presentation hopefully showed you the complexity of it. It's not as simple as using two languages in the classroom. There's a lot more to it. It can be very strategic and serve very important purposes throughout our bilingual schools. So on that, I want to thank you for taking the time on a Saturday to come listen to my presentation.